Hello, everyone. We are delighted that you are joining us today to talk about the DOL and SEC's best interest principles and how to leverage them for growth in 2024. A couple housekeeping items to go over with you all. We are recording this call today, and we will be sure to share it with you afterwards. And then also, we welcome you to engage with us and ask questions in the chat in Zoom. I will be monitoring those questions, and we've allotted about 15 minutes after the discussion to go over them and address them. Also, as many of you are probably similarly working from home, there may be some background noise, and we just appreciate your patience with that. Next, we are going to introduce our amazing panelists. I'm actually going to have each panelist introduce themselves, starting with you, Mr. Reish. Take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and hello, everybody. I'm Fred Reish. I'm a partner in the law firm of Faegre Drinker. I'm in the Los Angeles office, and the focus of my practice is on representing financial services businesses that provide services and products to retirement plans and IRAs. Robert, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. From snowy Lansing, Michigan, I'm Rob Dearman. I'm the founder and chief innovation officer of DCG Insights, which is a strategy consultancy for broker-dealers, RIAs, TAMPs, and product manufacturers. I also own two SEC RIAs. And so not only am I a consultant to firms trying to navigate the technology needed to implement new rules, I'm also a practitioner that has to eat my own cooking. Ed?
Well, Rob, I'm in Chicago and all the snow here is melted, so hopefully we'll send that warm weather your way in Lansing. But I'm Ed Wegner, and I am the practice lead for the governance, risk, and compliance practice at Oyster Consulting. Oyster provides consulting services to broker-dealers and investment advisors and other firms in the financial services industry, including compliance consulting, as well as business and operations consulting as well. And we've been working with a lot of our clients on the issues that we're going to talk about today. So really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk today and to share what we've been seeing around these really challenging issues.
And it's really an honor to share the floor with virtual floor with you, Fred, as well as Rob, and shout out to Grace for recently joining InvestorCOM. My name is Param Nasseri. If you've been following our webinar series, I'm somewhat of a familiar face, but I'll introduce myself quickly anyways. I head up our product and regulatory strategy here at InvestorCOM. And for those who may not have come across our technology in the past, we are a leading regulatory software provider for wealth managers across North America. Our award-winning applications, or solutions, I should say, are known to be more focused on intuitive solutions that help eliminate compliance risk and foster growth for our clients. Back over to you, Grace.
Thank you, Param. Yes, I am your MC today. While I'm not a panelist, I'm doing the introductions here. And I'm the new marketing director at InvestorCOM. Thank you, Param, for sharing about InvestorCOM, who we are and what we do. I have some exciting news. We launched a brand new product today called Account Compare that helps your firm to assess and document multiple account type recommendations. And if you're interested in learning more about this product or in diving into the topics that we are discussing on this webinar, helping your firm to streamline compliance, we have a team of experts that are waiting to talk with you, and you are welcome to set up a one-on-one consultation with us. We will have this QR code at the end, so there's no rush if you're not able to snap it right now, and we can move on to our agenda, Param. Thank you. So we have a great and lively discussion prepared today. First, we'll be talking about the DOL's proposed best interest principles and their impact on the industry. And then we'll discuss how those best interest requirements from the DOL overlap with the SEC's Reg BI. And then finally, we will discuss how the DOL and SEC best interest principles can provide a foundation and can be leveraged for growth in this new year. Thank you to everyone who participated in our pre-webinar poll. We do this to better understand how to direct and navigate our conversation and to see where you all are at. So with that, I will pass the baton to Param, who will go through those results.
Thank you, Grace. Let's jump in. So we began by asking, what's your top concern with respect to the DOL and SEC's best interest principles? And quite surprised by the response, and your response is fairly clear and evident. It begins with understanding the requirements, and it trickles down into training your staff and financial advisors, and then also assessing the impact, obviously, of the potential regulations on the business, and also, I guess somewhat of a surprise, but the impact on implementing technology on solutions is also a somewhat of a concern. So we'll dive into these a fair bit throughout today's conversation. We then asked, what aspect of compliance do you find most challenging, or complying with the requirements do you find most challenging? And the answers were, again, somewhat surprising, but probably logical. The greater majority saw documentation and evidence collection. It's funny that comes up because we started today's kind of conversation around that as being the biggest challenge with daily compliance requirements, and then also monitoring those requirements, as well as the formidable new term around assessing reasonably available alternatives continues to come up in our survey results. Surprise, surprise. We'll dive into that in a bit. And then we dug a layer deeper and asked, how do you rate the role of technology in achieving compliance with these key foundational principles? And the response was clear. Majority said extremely important, and then the second majority said somewhat important. So in aggregate, more than 90% really believe that the role of technology is important in embracing these requirements in the coming year. Last but not least, given our agenda and the themes around the webinar, we asked, given the regulatory background, where do you see the biggest opportunity for growth in 2024? And as you can see by the responses, majority see an opportunity for improving operational efficiency. There's always a segue to do that. We'll talk about that somewhat today. Got extremely well informed panelists to talk about that. And then there's always some room for differentiation. And quite honestly, the one that sort of hit me the most is enhancing client trust and increasing client retention. So really impressed by some of the responses we've seen in the poll results today. And thank you for participating. Without further ado, let's jump in. And by the way, I'm going to double click on what Grace said. Please use the chat box on your Zoom screen to submit any questions throughout today's conversation. Okay, so Mr. Fred Reich, thank you for joining us today. When we last met on October 31st, there was this sort of mad rush to get the proposal of the retirement security rule dropped and available in the marketplace. Since then, there's been a tremendous amount of attention, news headlines, you have it, around the market's response to this. In addition to that, more than 20,000 comment letters and a wide range of media attention and coverage on this. Are there any major changes in what you've heard since the proposed rule dropped?
Yeah, it's interesting. First, let me not answer your question by saying the one thing that was no surprise to anybody was that a one-time recommendation would be fiduciary advice. That I think was on everybody's radar. Now, when you get down into it, past that one-time recommendation idea, it's interesting how they expanded the range of things that they, meaning the Department of Labor, expanded the range of recommendations that could be fiduciary advice. For example, withdrawing money from a plan or an IRA, right, to maybe purchase an asset outside the plan, that will be fiduciary advice if the proposals go final in the same form as they are now. A recommendation of an investment policy like helping people with their IPS, recommendation of an investment strategy. All of those, if it's done for compensation, one time, point in time, will be fiduciary advice. So that was a bit of a surprise, very, very, very broad. The biggest surprise of all, though, I think, was the impact on the sale of annuities. And at the very top of the list of surprises is the recommendations of annuities to IRAs or plans or rollovers, whether they're for life insurance only annuities. In other words, what might be called an independent producer, a non-security annuity sold or recommended by an independent producer, will be a fiduciary act, and there's a prohibited transaction because of the commission. But then the surprise is prohibited transaction exemption 84-24, which puts a whole bunch of new rules, difficult rules, into play for all of the independent insurance agents around the country. That is going to be a heavy lift to get into compliance. Right below that is the sale of annuities, not by independent agents, but perhaps by what's called a statutory employee of an insurance company, the sale of a variable annuity, the sale of another annuity product that is a security. Those are all under PTE 2020-02. Not as much of a surprise, but certainly a change. When you get down to investment advisors and broker dealers, I think the big ones, yeah, there's some new requirements, but by and large, my experience is they stayed in compliance with the original PTE 2020-02, or at least largely in compliance, a much less heavy lift for them. You get to the smaller firms, so mid-market and smaller, I think there's quite a bit of work to get into compliance, and that's going to be coming around the corner fairly shortly.
I guess the contextual background behind us, I wonder if you can apply it a little bit, and I'll open this to the floor as well, around what people can see as next steps coming from the DOL on this particular policy.
Well, the comment period closed, the hearings have been held. That all happened was done by January 2nd. As you pointed out earlier, there are 20,000 or more comment letters, but the vast majority of those, I mean, a very, very high percentage are either I like it or I don't like it, period. The number of truly substantive comments is much, much less. The Department of Labor now has to review all those comments in the process of taking the regulation and the exemptions from proposed to final. My best guess is that they will get that done in roughly 3 months, which would be lightning fast for the government. So you say January 2nd, February 2nd is 1 month, March 2nd is 2 months, April 2nd is 3 months. So April or May, they'll have final rules, and they're sent it to the White House. Within the White House, it's the Office of Management and Budget. They'll take maybe 60 more days. So say June-ish, we should see the final rules published in the Federal Register. 60 days later, they'll become final effective rules. And then either at the same time they'll be applicable, meaning you have to comply, or there'll be a delayed applicability date. I think the delayed applicability date option is the more logical, more reasonable. Let's say though, January 1, 2025, everybody's got to be in compliance. Now, why did I pick January 1, 2025? The Department of Labor will want the rules to be not only final, but I believe they'll want them to be applicable before a new administration in the White House. Now, if the Democrats win, they could give an additional extension beyond that for the applicability date. But if the Republicans take over, they want it all in place, and they want financial service companies in compliance before the new administration takes office, because it's much, much harder to unwind it then. But that's my best bet. I'd be interested in what the other panelists think.
Yeah, Fred, I totally agree with the timeline you've laid out. And I think it's noteworthy that the 2 days of public hearing were held in the middle of the 60-day or the original comment period. This is unprecedented, not just at the DOL, but across all agencies. And it sort of sends a signal that they're rushing it. they are really pushing hard. So you have to ask yourself logically, why are they rushing it? And I think you're spot on. It has everything to do with this being an election year. And so I would be shocked if that thing was not only effective, but applicable before a new Congress could have anything to do about it, and makes it much harder. Also, it also puts, any sort of litigation under the gun. If you're going to bring a case together over the Administrative Procedures Act, for example, because of the public comment period overlapping with the public hearing, or if you were to go after the jurisdictional issues that we'll talk more about, that really puts those attorneys under the gun and forces them to get their act together very, very quickly.
I really hesitate to make any predictions given the long and winding road that this all has been on, but completely agree with both you, Fred, and Rob, in terms of the expectations. But it really is tough to say. I think there's going to be a rush. I think it's going to be a challenge, and we'll talk about where we are in terms of the implementation of this on the industry side. But it's a very challenging time within the industry to keep up with all of the requirements and regulations that are going on, both here and, other rules and regulatory agendas between now and the end of the year. So it's going to be a very difficult time for firms to be able to keep up with how this is moving forward, and then getting this implemented. And then there's always a concern about how much time and money and effort's been spent to date in getting prepared for things that kind of have to go back to the drawing board. So I think there's a lot of, there's a little bit of being gun shy in terms of the implementation of these things. So it's very challenging for the industry.
Ed, you remind me of my favorite philosopher, Yogi
Oh,
Berra.
God.
Yogi Berra.
Oh, there you go.
Who reportedly said, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future.
That's right. And I think that's the only philosopher that you might be able to draw a parallel with.
So, but that's a really good inflection point. I'm sure, we had almost 300 people signed up for today's webinar, and clearly there's a heavy degree of attendance here. I'm wondering, Rob, as you're working in a consulting capacity with your clients, there's been this ebb and flow of specific requirements that have stuck, some of that have sort of incrementally changed from time to time. What type of advice do you provide your clients who are sort of seeing yet another wave of kind of core best interest principles being applied here?
Yeah, and I have to admit, Param, Fred pointed out that large firms are sort of ahead of the curve, and a lot of them have already implemented some things for 2020-02 that they're going to try to reuse. But smaller firms, say firms sub 500 advisors or registered representatives or agents, it's been more of a challenge. And so I think if you take a step back, and if you've been in the industry, maybe not as long as Fred has, but as long as I have, you'll remember FINRA Rule 2111 and the enhancements. You'll remember FINRA Rule 2330 for 1035 exchanges for VAs. You'll remember that there's sort of this trajectory that got created when FINRA started going after, the recommendations of a brokerage account versus an advisory account, and doing an upfront comparison and try to project the long-term benefits of each. And if you look at that, there's sort of this hidden trend line that gets created among my clients, especially dual registrants who are offering, FINRA products, advisory platforms, and insurance products under 8424. And what you see is, look, there's been rules from the NAIC under Model Rule 275, annuity, best interest in annuity transactions. Of course, only 43 states have implemented. New York did their own thing. But I think if you even look at the requirements of Model Rule 275, it creates a trajectory which says, look, similar to what Reg BI and 2330 and 275 and all these things require, we want to see a careful documentation of the options. And we want you to show the client why this is the best recommendation you have for them right now. And then some like 2020-02 go farther and they say, look, something like services that you're going to receive and fit and the all-in fees, not just the headline fees, but the all-in expense ratios. I think you go back to 2330 and you go back to these rules, they're all sort of the same spirit. Right? Just look at Reg BI reasonable alternatives. And so what I see is, everybody sort of did a placeholder where they introduced a new form, a transaction admittal form or an order memorandum. And they tried to just get a free-form text field out there on a fillable PDF for clients to capture, the basis for reasonable or for best interest or the reasonable alternatives list. But what firms who have a little bit more technology investment or a little bit more focus, they move up this line of maturity. And so I always talk about the 3 levels of tech integration maturity. There's standardized, centralized, and automated. First, we struggle to standardize it. Let's just build a form and get it in front of the advisors. Then we've got to struggle to centralize the way that we use that free-form text. And so there's usually enhancements where we replace the free-form approach with drop-down lists and something that standardizes at a next level and centralizes it for OSJ managers or people providing investment review in the back office. And then the last level, automated, where we get some consistency in how we open accounts, how we place orders in the system, so that there's a more unified user experience and a more, pardon the expression, dummy-proof experience, where it becomes easier to comply with the entire overlapping landscape of regulations here. And so what we're trying to do in my consultancy is we're trying to do maximum good while we've got the patient open. Let's go back and look at the tech debt from 2330, from Reg BI, from 275, from 2020-02 rollover, and let's try to kill 7 birds with 1 stone while the patient is open here.
That's a new one, folks. You've heard it here first. Mr. Dearman's quote of the day. If we can tweet it right away, it's killing 7 birds with 1 stone.
The big stone.
And this topic of sort of shifts in regulatory expectations, I know is something that you work closely on, specifically around the retrospective review requirements. I'm curious how you would potentially answer some of those questions that will come up from your clients in your practice.
Well, and that was a good lead in, and both the panel questions that you had early on, and then Rob, what Rob's issues there. I think we're continuing to conduct retrospective reviews. The results that we've seen have been somewhat mixed, and I think a lot of that has to do with what Rob was talking about, is sort of that spectrum of how these things are progressing, and starting with let's just get something over the finish line. And so it's not surprising, given the fact that this rule is relatively new, even though it's been on this long and winding road and is fairly complex. And so what we've seen is that firms did just that. They tried to see what they could get over the finish line early on, and they're now reassessing those things. And those kind of and that kind of is what we're seeing in terms of the results of our review. So we've seen that firms have policies and procedures in place. They're doing the retrospective reviews. Some of those are a little bit late, but they're getting them done. Generally making appropriate disclosures, the fiduciary acknowledgement that, they're relying on some of the Reg BI disclosures and IA disclosures with respect to things like services and conflicts and things. Some of the more significant findings, though, that we're seeing is that firms aren't necessarily including all the factors that need to be considered that the DOL outlined in terms of when they're providing advice to retirement investors. And so we talk about forms that have been developed and policies and procedures, making sure that firms are considering those specific things, especially in regards to the factors that need to be considered when making recommendations related to rollovers. Similarly, we've seen that challenges with respect to firms being able to get the required plan information when making rollover recommendations, or making reasonable estimates using benchmarking information. So that's been a big challenge for firms, especially when they're trying to do this in a much more manual sense and not relying on technology to be able to help in that regard. We've seen an over-reliance on the advisors in the field in terms of conducting the analysis, using manual forms, which in and of themselves aren't bad, but without proper guidance and training in terms of what types of information they need to be reviewing, what things they need to be considering, how to do the analysis, and then doing so in some cases without access to the plan or benchmarking information. And this has really led to what we're finding in terms of insufficient documentation and disclosures. And so that's really the issue that we're dealing with up front. I think, again, firms, we're looking to see if let's get a form together that we can get out in front of our advisors. They're making good efforts, but what they're finding is a lot of inconsistency in terms of how that's being implemented in the field. So what we've really been advising firms to do as a result of that is to kind of go back to their procedures, make sure that they're identifying all the things that are required, reassessing their processes, making sure that those processes take into account all the things that they need to consider when making those types of recommendations, making sure that they're training their advisors in terms of how they do the analysis, what they need to document, and then making sure that they're providing access to the appropriate information that the advisors are going to need in the field moving forward. So I think we're very much in the early stages. As Rob had mentioned, I think what we're finding are the types of things you'd expect to find in the early stages of the implementation of a new rule. But as we start moving forward, I think firms are really going to be involved in sort of reassessing what they put in place and coming up with new processes and procedures.
Love that. Thanks for sharing that, Ed. Fred, let me ask you this: in terms of sort of the assessing the impact on the what the proposed requirements will be for the industry. You touched on earlier sort of around sort of creating a bit of a hierarchy in terms of which sides of the industry would be impacted the most. But if you were to look at what the SEC's requirements are around best interest, or we'll call it Reg BI, and sort of compare it against the expectations that are outlined from the DOL centrally around maybe rollovers and account type recommendations, do you see much of a parallel between them?
Yes, there's a tremendous parallel, and I think that's been underestimated. To really fully appreciate the parallel, you have to go back and look at, I think it was from 2 years ago, there was a SEC staff bulletin on a selection of account types. That's really where you can line the DOL proposal now up with what the SEC expectations are. There are actually very few differences. For example, one difference on paper, but maybe less so in reality, is that the DOL is going to require that you actually document certain recommendations, like document why a rollover is in the best interest of what they call the retirement investor. For example, as the right-hand column on the screen shows, there are 5 rollovers. There's plan to IRA. This is DOL language. Plan to IRA, plan to plan, IRA to IRA, IRA to plan, or change of an account type within a plan or an IRA. Those are all rollover recommendations. The reason why that's in the best interest of the investor has to be reduced to writing for specific reasons, and it have to be provided to the retirement investor. So that sort of begs, what the heck is a retirement investor? Well, if you go over under, that is a plan, a participant in a plan, a private sector plan, a participant in a plan, or an IRA owner. So that requirement for written documentation is one difference. But the similarity is both the SEC and the DOL expect a comparative analysis to be done before you can recommend any of those rollover types. What do I mean by comparative analysis? I think you divide the information into 3 buckets. Bucket number 1 is a good investor profile. What are the needs and the characteristics of this particular investor? Bucket number 2 is, where is the money now and what are the attributes of that? The DOL describes that as, for example, if we do look at a plan to IRA rollover, what are the investments in the plan, the services in the plan, and the expenses in the plan? Bucket number 3 is the proposed IRA. What are we going to do for this retirement investor, this participant, if they roll over? What are the services? What are the investments? What are the expenses and the IRA? You then examine bucket 2, the plan, and bucket 3, the IRA. You do an evaluation of those in light of bucket 1, the profile of the investor, and make a recommendation that's in the best interest of the retirement investor. That is the process expected by the SEC. That is the process expected by the DOL. So the similarities are remarkable, and the differences are actually very few. So that's a big picture answer to your question.
Thank you, Fred. And I'm sure you read this. We didn't really sort of talk about this off the top, but there's been a tremendous amount of SEC sort of findings on exam observations, and then most recently the FINRA came up with their regulatory oversight report recently. And again, I think it segues into what Fred just shared around sort of the parallels between what the SEC's expectations are around assessing reasonably available alternatives, doing that comparative analysis. Do you have any observations on that?
Well, no, I think, and what you've seen in terms of what the regulators have been doing to, in how they've been reviewing for these requirements. They started out, this kind of tracks what Rob was talking about earlier in terms of, the implementation of new rules, but they started by just focusing at the start about looking at some of the low-hanging fruit, like making sure that you have the policies and procedures in place, making sure that you're doing the disclosures, Form CRS, doing them on time. And they've really been now focusing on more substantive areas around things like the care obligation, and specifically around the reasonably available alternatives assessment that's done as part of the care obligation, or that needs to be done as part of the care obligation. And as Fred had mentioned, the account type recommendations under Reg BI. And so I think what you're going to find is, as the regulators go out and conduct examination, is you're going to see more and more guidance about what they're seeing in the field when they're going out there relative to what their expectations are with respect to those areas. And so I think though that type of guidance is really terrific, that it's coming out. So I think firms should really take a look at that and use that to assess their current plans. And FINRA's recently issued report, and they work very closely with the SEC because this is the SEC's rule, and they don't want to deviate from how the SEC is interpreting the requirements here. But they do a really nice job of laying out in that document the key considerations that they would expect you to have, the common findings that they're seeing on the exam, so you can kind of see what types of things they're seeing firms, what are their expectations there. If they're calling them findings, these are the things that they think might be being done wrong. And then effective practices. And so I think if you take a document like that and use it to assess your programs around how you're implementing Reg BI and the other areas that they identified in that report, I think it's really helpful, especially as you're doing your annual testing.
Absolutely. I mean, the commonalities and the trends between the two sort of, I'll call it best interest principles, is certainly eye-opening. And then, but more recently, the FINRA annual oversight report sort of talked.
And one thing real quickly, just to kind of echo what Fred was saying on the DOL SEC side, I think one of the things that you're seeing too with Reg BI, and you're seeing this in the recent guidance that's come out from the SEC and their staff bulletins, is a recognition of the convergence of the standard of care between broker-dealers and investment advisors. And they identify that they recognize that the relationships with the clients might be different if you're a broker versus an investment advisor, but the expectations in terms of the duty of care are very similar, if not the same. The application might be different, but I really think that where they're moving to is that they see that the means might be different, but the ends are the same. And so I don't think you're going to see them have different expectations depending on whether you're a broker dealer or an investment advisor. So it's very similar in terms of the convergence that Fred was saying on the DOL and Reg BI, but also the expectations around investment advisors and broker dealers.
Yeah, and we started to see that in examinations on your account type recommendations below. You know, BDs, this is old hat. Your FINRA examiner is asking you about this. And some CCOs early on would push back and say, hey, wait a minute, that's investment advisory. That's outside of your jurisdiction. But in the end, every broker dealer I consult with has something up front where they disclose that. And Parham, just a comment, we've got technology check marks on the right-hand side as potential solutions for all of these care obligation and disclosure obligations, but there are some gotchas in how you design the technology. What you want to do is you want to design it so that it doesn't create more friction in the point of sale, right? And so down at the bottom, you know, there's sort of this Maslow's hierarchy of needs where I can use technology to meet the letter of the law and survive, right? But some folks who have done e-delivery projects, for example, didn't go all the way with it. And they didn't automate email bounce backs. Or maybe they automated the delivery of documents to a client vault, but then they didn't put the oversight in place to show that clients actually were logging in and accessing those documents at least once within 3, 6, 9, 12 months, right? And so measure twice, cut once is the lesson of the past here. Take a look at that Maslow's hierarchy of what sort of digital enabled interactions you want to have with your clients and your advisors, and look ahead. That's that centralize, standardize, automate that I was talking about. The automation will go to that last degree so that when an examiner shows up or when you have to do a retrospective review, the data is right there in your systems to make it easy. Literally push button, pre-canned reports or even ad hoc query polls. And on the top, just one more comment, automatically compare the recommended products to reasonable alternatives, right? In the past, that has been a very product type specific thing. Like in 2330, it's been VA to VA. And there's certainly plenty of riders and sub-account approaches to compare. Or it might have been share class, right? The cheapest mutual fund available in a silo. But one of the things that I'm seeing maybe my more advanced clients thinking about are from a financial planning perspective, the outcomes that the clients have designated as their target. And so instead of that comparison of recommended products, it might be a little more expansive into recommended strategies. So for example, if you're one of the 10,000 boomers who are retiring today, and in your financial plan, you say sustainable income is my #1 financial planning goal. Having reasonable alternatives that might contemplate a bond ladder versus a VA with a living benefit versus a SPIA versus a preferred stock or dividend stock portfolio. And so some of my maybe more progressive clients are starting to try to incorporate their financial planning approach and the compliance with the care obligation.
Love that, Rob. And I just have a couple of kind of follow-up questions to that, because it sort of segues into the second theme of the conversation today, which is you've got these regulatory requirements, and there is certainly a trend, as we've talked about, between the parallels between the SEC's requirements on BI as well as the DOL. And then, you know, we're in 2024, and there's a lot of folks that are sort of thinking about how to budget for fostering growth in their business, how to sort of plant which ships where. What would you say, Rob, should be sort of, to your point about Maslow's hierarchy of needs from a technology implementation perspective, how should firms sort of look to 24 as an opportunity to grow given the regulatory requirements?
Yeah, well, I've been predicting this for many, many years, back when we were talking about BICs and BICEs, that, you know, back in the olden days when you did a home office visit to pick a broker dealer or to pick an RIA aggregator, when it was time for the compliance department to come in, the recruiter would say, keep it short. And the only message that they wanted to intimate when compliance was in front of your recruit was that we're business friendly, right? Nowadays, I think more and more, especially RIAs and large OSJs, are really coming to appreciate what enterprise risk management means. And this is becoming part of the analysis when they are looking to hire a new service provider, whether that's a BD enterprise like one of the large networks, or whether that's even a compliance service provider, is show me how you manage risk in general terms, right? Because now they've all got to go through their annual review. They've all got to create their inventory of conflicts. And, the bar is being raised. Today is the easiest compliance environment any of us will be in our careers, because the bar continues to be raised. And so I think 2024 is yet again one of those opportunities to use automated risk management as a differentiator. People have been looking at things like client portals or CRM integration with, digital account onboarding. How many more digital account onboarding projects am I going to do as a consultant? And yet the way that we've done them has left compliance almost as an afterthought. That, yeah, we've got a Protogen or an Actimize or our own proprietary post-trade review system. Check. As opposed to bringing your duty of care, your duty of loyalty, your reasonable alternative, bringing that to the forefront so that truly the advisor has the power to submit in good order business as well as compliant with written supervisory procedures business upfront, and minimize the amount of after the fact compliance hassle that they have to experience. I think the firms that really get that, where we're pushing more of that to the front end and into client facing material, and we're getting serious about automated enterprise risk management, those are the firms that do stand to have a new tool to leverage for competitive differentiation.
Just on that point, as we've talked to clients and we do assessments over different solutions and things, apart from cost, which is always the primary factor that people want to consider when comparing different solutions, a big one has to do with ease of use. And that's because of the people that you have in the field and how complicated it's become to just do their jobs. And Rob, you talked about compliance being an afterthought. It's an add-on, but it's a difficult add-on, right? And so the more you can integrate that with the other things that you're doing, make it part of the process, that integration, trying to make that process it has to be effective, but as effective and easy to use, I think you're going to differentiate yourself in terms of, recruiting. You'll be more compliant, and I think you can take advantage of those opportunities.
And Ed, that starts with inviting the compliance folks to the conversation at the beginning of the project,
right?
Not just waiting for them to, quote, sign off on the spec or the scope document. You might be surprised if you're not in compliance. There are such things as creative compliance people who actually love design and do want to eliminate friction proactively. And so where those folks are not part of project kickoffs and scope and requirements, invite them in, even if they're just silent participants in the beginning. An ounce of prevention is worth $200,000 in fines sometimes.
Absolutely love the theme of the conversation. And actually, I think it's, weaving in regulatory requirements into new digital applications is frankly all we're about, and creating intuitive, consistent processes. So maybe I can sprinkle some hard data on the screen, and my animation's kind of rolled ahead of me, but this sort of feeling of regulatory pressure, whether you're looking at the DOL's proposed requirements or the SEC's, really helped us shape some of the data that we're about to show you. And starting with rollovers, we had 4 of our clients, you start picking up the digital application and making it a requirement across all their advisors. And when that manual process that we've been talking about around assessing what the client's needs are, Fred, you said this a lot better than I can. The second phase being assessing what's the degrees of service today, and then how they're going to be different in a post rollover or in an IRA environment, is something that we're seeing technology can actually improve quite a bit. And the data speaks for itself. So over the past 12 months, not the past 12 months, or I should say over a 12-month rolling period, we are seeing increased usage of our application and making rollovers consistently. So if you go from September of 2022 to August of 23, you can actually observe a 2.5 time increase in usage of those digital applications versus, I'll call it the more manual approach of tackling this. The other data point that I sprinkled on the screen is over another 12-month period, this is another one of our clients, and what we observed here is the total assets across 739 advisors, we saw over 14,000 rollovers, the rollover recommendations being made. And again, you put that into context from a firm that does things manually. How can you actually monitor the data and gather intelligence across your process if it's done in a manual form? So with those 14,000, what we observed was a bit of a holy cow type of a moment, because we saw over $8 billion of rollovers being recommended, and the average size of the rollovers was over $500,000. If you all have been watching some industry data around this, typically the industry average is around $200,000 per rollover recommendation. It's $192,000, the last data point I can actually cite off the top of my head. And so when you're using digital applications, you're fostering a behavior of compliance across your practice and looking up plan costs and documenting the analysis. And then, I mean, the data speaks for itself. So you can certainly see the level of adoption and usage, as well as growth opportunity that creates for firms as they're looking at these pending requirements in 2024. We're at the time where we typically take up questions. Folks, again, this is a great opportunity to hit our panelists up with any questions. I know a few came in through the chat here. Let's jump into those. Any comments, panelists, before we jump in? Fantastic. Okay. There's a question actually that came in during our poll that we did, and Fred, this might be a little bit tricky, but I'll throw it your way. The Secure 2.0 gives the option of moving 529 plan funds into Roth IRAs. Sources refer to this transaction as a transfer or rollover. Since Secure 2.0 came out after PT 2020-02, is there any guidance, any sort of tips around how to tackle this from a DOL or IRS guidance perspective?
No, there really hasn't been anything that the DOL or the IRS has issued on the 529 to Roth IRA transfer at all. I think it's it's a fairly easy analysis in the sense that transferring it to the beneficiary's Roth IRA would ordinarily automatically be in the best interest, because you would assume that the beneficiary of the 529 plan has already graduated from college and they've spent all their money except what's left over. And so they're out of school, they finished their college education, and that money's sitting there. It can be transferred to a Roth IRA and over time withdrawn much more favorably from a tax perspective than it could be if it were left in the 529 plan. So it seems to me it's a fairly easy recommendation to make in the best interest of the 529 beneficiary. So I would think you would satisfy any best interest standard, securities, insurance, DOL, IRS, without a whole lot of difficulty.
And bless you if you have leftover money in your 529 after paying tuition.
That was good, Ed. That was good. Well done. Okay, there's another question around, Rob, you got a few questions related to your analogy that you provided, so I think that was tackled. Let's see here. There is, under fiduciary definition, there was a mention of not just retirement accounts. Do you mean not qualified accounts? And are they now covered under DOL?
Was that for me?
Yeah, I think when you talked about expanding the definitions, you referred to distributions and some other things.
Yeah, it has to be a recommendation to a retirement investor, which would be like an IRA owner, a participant in a private sector retirement plan, or planned fiduciaries. So you start off with the fact that it's a recommendation to a retirement investor, and then there's 3 different categories of investments in the proposed regulation that could apply to. taking a distribution, rolling it over, just taking money out of the plan, for example, and investing it outside the plan. I've seen some insurance proposals to do those kinds of things, take money out of an IRA or a plan. So there is a much broader range of types of recommendations that would be covered by the definition of fiduciary. Now, if you're an investment advisor working with an IRA, say, and you're providing pure level fee advice, neither you nor your firm is receiving any other compensation, no proprietary products, no revenue sharing, no nothing, pure level fee advice. If you're providing advice to an IRA as pure level fee advice, then you are a fiduciary for this purpose, but it doesn't have any meaning because the fiduciary standard of care doesn't apply to IRAs. It would be your industry standard, SEC, RIA, or Reg BI, for example, because you don't have a conflict of interest. If you had a conflict of interest, then you would need to do PTE 2020-02, which brings into play the best interest standard, which is really the fiduciary standard. Now, let's say you were providing pure level fee advice to a plan or to a participant's account in the plan. No other revenue to your firm, pure level fee. Yes, you're a fiduciary, and yes, you have to satisfy the prudent man rule and the duty of loyalty under ERISA, but you aren't obligated to comply with PTE 2020-02 because there's no conflict of interest. There's no prohibited transaction. PTE is prohibited transaction exemption, meaning it's an exception to the prohibited transaction rules. So about half or more of what we've talked about today applies when you have a conflict of interest. That's where compliance gets much more difficult. All these disclosure requirements, the annual retrospective review, the policies and procedures, all of that conversation today is where you have a conflict of interest. An obvious example of a conflict of interest, in addition to a couple of things I mentioned a second ago, is if you recommend somebody roll over from a plan to an IRA with you, and then you either get commissions or fees out of the IRA. That commission or fee is a prohibited transaction. That's why you need to comply with all of the different requirements we've talked about today.
Thank you, Fred. That's fantastic. So the questions are coming in fast and furiously. There is a question that probably we touched on early on, but just to confirm, Fred, the 5-part test will no longer determine the fiduciary duty. Can you confirm? Yes,
that's it. When this becomes effective and applicable, that will be the case because we're dealing with proposals right now. But the 5-part test, it's going to become some people call a 2-part test. I call a 3-part test. One, are you in the business of making investment or insurance recommendations? Is that your business? Number 2, is the recommendation individualized or personalized based on the particular investor? Number 3, is it reasonable for the particular investor to believe that the recommendation is being made in the best interest of the retirement investor? If you satisfy those 3, which I'll call a 3-part test, yes, that'll be the new rule. Forget the 5-part test. Forget you have to provide advice to that particular investor on a regular basis. In effect, because everybody on the call is probably in the business, so you satisfied category 1. Who's going to make a recommendation that isn't individualized? The SEC says you have to get an investor profile. Well, that's the first step in individualization. And number 3, who isn't going to make a best interest recommendation because Reg BI requires that, the investment advisor interpretation requires that. As Rob mentioned, the NAIC Model Rule 275 contemplates that. So essentially, just forget everything I just said and say one-time recommendation to a retirement investor, and you'll be 99.9% right.
Excellent, excellent. I think we have time for one more question, and it's a good one. I'll throw it out there. Do RIAs that serve, I think, under 338 ERISA investment managers need to rely on PTE 2020-02 exemptions and perform look-back reviews? I think they mean retrospective reviews, given that they are contractual fiduciaries?
I'll give you a good answer, a good lawyer answer, yes and no. Generally speaking, under no circumstance could a discretionary investment manager or 338 for a plan, a participant account, or an IRA rely on PTE 2020-02 for conflicts of interest. Why do I say that? Because PTE 2020-02 only applies to non-discretionary recommendations. So why did I say at the beginning, yes and no? Well, if you're a plan advisor and you recommend to the plan fiduciaries that they hire you to manage participant accounts, that recommendation is a non-discretionary recommendation. So that's covered by PTE 2020-02. If you're a discretionary advisor to a plan or a participant account and you recommend a rollover is a non-discretionary recommendation. So PTE 2020-02 would apply, even though you were a discretionary manager in a plan and a discretionary manager in the IRA. The actual rollover recommendation itself is non-discretionary because you can't reach in and grab the money and take it out in your discretion. So it's a little complicated, but you get to the point that only non-discretionary advisory services can get the benefit of PTE 2020-02. You cannot get them if you're a discretionary investment manager. You can't get the relief of 2020-02.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Fred. There is a sort of a question that's been coming up. We've been getting it a lot around sort of the threat of potential litigation, given the proposed Department of Labor's requirements here that are being pondered at the moment. Any thoughts? I'll kind of mark that as the final question. Any thoughts or predictions on that potential court case?
Rob and I have talked about that. I'm going to let Rob answer. You can give my answer, Rob.
Yeah, so Fred and I have talked about what is the percentage likelihood that litigation will happen? And I believe, Fred, your answer was 110%.
Yes.
My answer last week was 99.999%. And the reason I say 99.999 is we don't see the final rule. It is possible in some hypothetical universe that the DOL, despite all of their past, incorporates all of the feedback, all of the meaningful feedback of about 2,000 of the 20,000 response letters. And we see a completely different rule come out the other end. I put 0.0001% likelihood of that happening, which is why I give 5 nines. But I think there's plenty of grounds here. If you want to go back and rewatch Brad Campbell's testimony at the House Financial Services Committee, I think he gives one of the strongest arguments, which is in ERISA, there's Title I for employer-sponsored plans, and there's Title II for individual retirement accounts. And it's Brad's contention that this does not apply to Title II, that there was never any original congressional authority for a standard of care to be designated. So there is this sort of power under Title II that was created starting back in 2015. And if you read the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals judgment, you'll find they acknowledge that there is a limit to that jurisdiction that sort of carves out Title II. And so whether it's APA, whether it's jurisdictional issues, whether it's some new concern, I think it is very likely that we are going to have litigation, very, very likely. And so the question I keep getting when we're talking about technology strategy and tech roadmaps for the end of this year is, do we need to carve out some time and space to rework either inserting a new vendor or reworking our account or our order entry or our rollover process? And my answer is an emphatic yes. We do need to plan for it being effective and implemented by January 1, 2025. That is my best advice to you. And so we've got a lot of people who are reworking Q3 and Q4's tech roadmaps as a result of that, despite the fact that we're likely to go through litigation. Now, Fred, how long is that litigation going to last, do you think, if it happens?
Yeah, that's the key, Rob. Particularly if the Democrats retain the White House, which we won't know till November, they will litigate it all the way to the Supreme Court. So these rules may be applicable January 1, 2025, We'll have to comply all of 2025. We'll have to comply all of 2026. Maybe in 2027 or 2028, we'll finally get a Supreme Court decision on whether or not these rules are valid. So I don't think people should take the probability of litigation as meaning we don't need to be working on compliance. I think that would be a significant mistake, and you'll be into a crisis mode at the end of this year if you follow that path. So be working on this. And just to quickly on what Ed said earlier, absolutely, I think advisor training is critical. I think that is a critical, in many cases, missing component. And I think people, again, agreeing with Ed, people rushed to the finish line to get a lot of this in effect. I have clients now going back and looking and saying, whoops, we did the best we could with the time pressures we had, but we realize now that we can and should improve that. So I would use the next few months until we see the final rule to make sure you're already in the right place so that you can move on from there with adjustments for the final rules.
Thank you so much, Fred, Rob, and Ed, our esteemed panelists, as well as Param. And also thank you to everyone for attending. We have just reached that hour mark. But if you're interested in learning more about these topics and interested in streamlining compliance across your firm, don't hesitate to reach out to us via this QR code. And we just appreciate your time. Also, if you had any questions that we weren't able to answer on the call, our team will be reaching out to you individually, and we'll also send a recording of the webinar today to you. So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and week.
Goodbye, everybody.
Take care.